It started one early morning when John Harris woke to a deep, distant rumble that shook the pictures on his wall. A sound too heavy and too steady to be thunder, a sound that made the windows tremble. The smell of diesel drifted in through the half-open window, sharp and oily. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, pulled on his boots, and stepped onto the porch of his ranch house. The sunrise painted the wide fields gold, but what caught his eyes was not the beauty of the dawn. It was the chaos happening beyond the barn. Across his land, heavy machines crawled like metal beasts, scooping dirt, grinding gears, tearing open the soil that had been in his family for generations. Dust hung thick in the morning air, swirling around bright yellow vests and flashing lights. John's heart tightened. This was his property, his pride, his home. He walked quickly, then faster, until he was running, shouting over the roar of engines. "Hey, stop that! What are you doing on my land?" One of the workers, a broad man with dark glasses and a careless smirk, barely looked at him before saying, "We're laying down the new HOA water pipeline. Orders from the board." The words hit John like a slap. HOA? The Homeowners Association? They had no right to be here, no permission, no notice, no respect. His boots sank into the soft churned soil as he moved closer to the trench, a raw wound cutting across the green fields he had tended for years. He could see where the machines had crushed his fence posts and broken his irrigation lines. He stood there for a moment, fists clenched, watching a bulldozer push another slice of earth aside, and something inside him burned. He stormed toward the supervisor, a thin man holding a clipboard, who looked startled to see him approach. "This is private property," John said, his voice steady but cold. "Show me your permit. Who signed off on this?" The supervisor shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "Talk to the HOA president, sir. We're just following the work order." John took a deep breath, fighting the anger bubbling in his chest. He turned away and stared at the horizon, where the trench stretched like a scar cutting through his land. He had lived here his whole life, had paid his dues, paid his taxes, and kept peace with everyone. But this was a line crossed. By noon, he heard the familiar hum of a luxury SUV. The HOA president, Karen Reed, stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses, heels too tall for the dirt road, and a smile that was more of a challenge than a greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," she said sweetly, brushing dust off her blazer. "I see you've noticed our little project." John looked at her expressionless. "Little project? You're digging a trench through my land." She waved a hand dismissively. "It's for the betterment of the community. A new water pipeline. The board approved it unanimously. You'll thank us later when property values go up." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You didn't ask. You didn't get permission. This is still my land." Her smile hardened. "We have the city's blessing. Don't make this difficult, John. We're all neighbors here." John felt his pulse hammering in his neck. She turned her back before he could reply, calling out to the workers, "Keep going, boys. We're right on schedule." The machines roared again, drowning out everything she said next. John stood in the cloud of dust left behind as her SUV rolled away. He stared at the earth, his earth, torn open without care. He wanted to yell, to block the machines, but he knew better. He wasn't a man who acted out of rage. He was a man who planned, who watched, who waited. He walked back to his porch, sat on the old wooden chair, and stared at the fields for a long time. The sound of the engines echoed over the hills like an insult. He remembered his father's voice from years ago, telling him, "Son, don't ever let anyone take what's yours without a fight. The land remembers." The ranch had been in the Harris family for 3 generations. Every fence, every tree line, every creek had been mapped and recorded. He knew every inch of it better than anyone alive. As the sun climbed higher, the machines carved deeper. The trench now stretched almost half a mile, cutting through the center of his property. He saw pipes being lowered in, men laughing, cigarette smoke drifting into the morning wind. He took pictures on his phone, evidence, details, timestamps. By afternoon, a storm began to form on the horizon, dark clouds rolling in. the noise of thunder mixed with the growl of engines. It felt almost poetic, like nature itself was angry. The first drops of rain hit the dust, turning it to mud, but the workers didn't stop. John watched them through narrowed eyes, rain streaking down his face. He whispered quietly, "You don't know what you've done." When night fell, the machines finally stopped, their headlights cutting through the dark as they drove off toward the main road. The ranch fell quiet again, the only sound the distant croak of frogs and the gentle drip of water from the barn roof. John stood at the edge of the trench, flashlight in hand. The air smelled of wet soil and oil. He crouched, running his fingers along the damp earth, following the direction of the pipe they had laid. He knew exactly where it was going, and more importantly, he knew exactly what it connected to. Because under his ranch ran more than dirt. There was a hidden line, an older, deeper network that stretched to the main water grid of the entire county. It wasn't public knowledge, but John had made sure of that years ago when he started Harris Utilities, a quiet company that managed the distribution of water to nearby developments, including the HOA's own subdivision. He had built it in silence under a different name, letting the HOA believe they bought their water from a city supplier. But in truth, every drop that flowed into their faucets came from wells and treatment systems that he owned. The thought made him almost smile. He walked along the trench again, the beam of his flashlight flickering over the fresh pipes. "You dug into your own lifeline," he said softly to himself, "and you don't even know it." The next morning, Karen returned with a few board members, umbrellas in hand. They walked the site, giving orders, acting like conquerors. John watched them from the porch, silent. When she finally noticed him, she called out, "Mr. Harris, everything's coming along beautifully. Once this is done, we'll be free from overpriced suppliers. It's going to save everyone so much money." John raised an eyebrow. "Overpriced suppliers?" She nodded proudly. "Yes, we're switching to a private line. Independent. No more paying through third parties." He hid his smile behind a straight face. "Good luck with that," he said quietly, turning back toward his house. As the days went on, the trench grew longer and the damage deeper. His fences were gone, a section of his irrigation destroyed, and his cattle couldn't cross to the pasture anymore. But John didn't complain. He just watched. Neighbors came by asking what was happening. He gave vague answers. The less people knew, the better. Inside his office, he reviewed old maps and contracts. Every line of legal text confirmed the same thing. The HOA was trespassing on private property, damaging a commercial water route, and violating state law. He had all the proof he needed. At sunset, he poured himself a cup of coffee and stared at the fading light. The machines were parked now, their shadows long across the field. In the distance, he could see the HOA's water tower glinting faintly in the light, his water tower, technically. Every pipe that reached it, every valve, every connection had his company's stamp somewhere on it. He thought about his next move. He could call the police, file a lawsuit, or make a scene. But that wasn't John's style. He preferred quiet storms, the kind that hit when no one was looking. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked out to the barn and stood near the trench again. The sky was clear now, stars spread wide and bright. The land was still. He crouched, touching the cold metal of the newly installed pipe. "You're drinking from my wells," he whispered. "And soon you'll realize it." He felt calm, certain, patient. He knew power wasn't loud. It was quiet. It waited. And when it moved like a tide no one could stop. By morning, the HOA had brought in new trucks. Karen strutted around giving orders, pointing at maps, pretending she was leading some grand engineering project. John watched from his porch, sipping coffee, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. He knew she thought she was untouchable. He knew she believed her paperwork and her confidence could protect her. She had no idea she was standing on top of the one thing she could never control: his system, his company, his land. And as the sun rose higher, the noise grew louder, and the trench carved deeper. John Harris stood quietly, the wind lifting the brim of his hat. No one saw the look in his eyes, a look not of anger, but of calculation. They had come onto his land without asking. They had taken what was his without thought. And soon, very soon, he would remind them that not everything that runs beneath the ground is theirs to claim. The day had started with the sound of machines, but the story that had begun would end with something far more powerful: silence. The silence of every faucet in their perfect little neighborhood running dry. John woke up early the next morning to the sound of those same engines rumbling again, this time even louder, echoing across the valley like thunder. The trench had doubled in size overnight, cutting deep through the heart of his ranch. He stood at the porch railing, gripping the wood tightly, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowing as he watched the workers moving like ants in bright yellow vests. They had no right to be here, but they carried on as if they owned the place. He could see tire tracks carved into the soft earth, the soil churned to mud, his fence now completely gone in one section. The air smelled of fuel and dust, and the sound of clanging metal filled the air. John walked down to the site again, boots crunching against gravel, his hat pulled low against the wind. When he reached the edge of the trench, one of the workers pointed at him and laughed under his breath. "The old man's mad again," someone said, but John didn't respond. He looked down at the papers in his hand, the original property deed, stamped and notarized decades ago, clearly marking the boundaries of his land. He had built his home here long before the HOA had even existed. He marched straight toward the temporary office trailer that now stood on his property and pushed open the door. Inside, Karen Reed was sitting at a folding table, talking to a contractor. She looked up, irritation flashing across her face before she forced a smile. "John, you can't just walk in here," she said smoothly, trying to sound polite but clearly annoyed. "We're busy." John dropped the folder onto the table. The sound of the heavy papers hitting the metal surface made both of them jump slightly. "You're trespassing," he said firmly, his voice calm but cold. "You didn't get approval. You didn't even notify me. You have no right to dig a single inch of dirt on my land." Karen sighed dramatically, crossing her arms. "John, the community approved this project. It's not personal. It's for everyone's benefit." He stared at her, unblinking. Community approval doesn't override private property laws. She leaned back, smirking. "You should read the new annexation agreement. The HOA can request access for infrastructure if it benefits all residents." John tilted his head. "I'm not part of your HOA." That made her pause for just a second, her confidence slipping, but she quickly regained her tone. "The city supports it," she said. "It's all legal." John leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the table, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've made a mistake," he said quietly, "and you don't even see it yet." Then he turned and walked out without another word. Behind him, he could hear Karen mutter something about stubborn old men. But he didn't care. Outside, the machines kept grinding, the workers kept digging, and the ground kept breaking. The trench now stretched far beyond his main pasture, dangerously close to the underground utility path that only he and a few city engineers knew about. He knew exactly what that meant. The HOA was about to cut into the very line that carried their own water supply, the one they were trying to replace. He went back to his house and sat down at his kitchen table, spreading the documents across the wood. The papers showed every detail of the Riverline water network: routes, depths, control valves, contracts, signatures, and right there, under owner and operator, it said Harris Utilities LLC. That was him, his company, his system, and the HOA had no clue they were laying their new pipes directly into it. He had built it years ago, carefully hidden under different business names, ensuring that no one could trace ownership easily. The HOA thought they were buying water from a regional supplier. They had no idea that the man they were disrespecting now was the very one who controlled their supply. That thought brought the faintest smile to his face. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer, an old friend named David Kentucky. "David," he said calmly, "they've started digging through my property." There was a pause on the other end before David spoke. "Without your consent?" "None. Not a word of notice." David sighed. "Document everything. Photos, names, timestamps. Don't confront them directly again. Let them finish the mistake. They'll hang themselves with it later." John nodded. Already started, he said quietly. Good, David replied. When they realize what they've damaged, we'll be ready. Later that afternoon, John drove down to the county records office. The woman at the counter recognized him immediately. Morning, Mr. Harris, she said kindly. Back for more land papers? Just verifying some records, he replied, sliding a few documents across the counter. I need to confirm easement rights along the west field. She typed quickly, scanning her screen. After a moment, she frowned. There's no HOA easement recorded here, she said. Your land isn't under their jurisdiction. They never filed for permission. John nodded, a quiet satisfaction flickering in his chest. That's all I needed, he said, gathering his papers. By the time he returned home, the trench had reached the lower ridge near his water main. The workers were pounding in new metal pipes, laughing, shouting over the noise of engines. He stood there at the fence line, watching in silence, letting the wind carry the dust across his boots. Karen arrived again just before sunset, talking loudly into her phone. Yes, the line will connect by tomorrow, she said, her voice sharp with authority. We'll be completely off the supplier by the end of the week. John waited until she hung up, then called out, You're making a big mistake. She turned with that same smug grin. John, please, she said in a mocking tone. You don't understand business. We're saving everyone money. He stared at her, his voice steady. You're cutting into a line you don't own. She laughed out loud, turning to the workers. See what I mean? He's paranoid. Let's keep moving. As night fell, John stood near the trench again, flashlight in hand, the cool air thick with the scent of wet soil and machinery. He crouched down, running his fingers along the edge of the pipe they'd installed. It connected exactly where he thought it would, straight into the main network. He felt a strange calm wash over him. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to fight. The HOA had already built its own trap. He turned off the flashlight, walked back to his truck, and looked out over the dark, silent land. Somewhere in the distance, water still flowed quietly through his pipes, steady and strong, carrying life to every home in the subdivision. They thought they were breaking free from him, but they had only dug deeper into his control. Back at home, he poured himself a glass of water from his own tap, clear and cold. He stared at it for a long moment before setting it down. Let them keep digging, he murmured to himself. They'll find out soon enough. The next morning, when he drove past the site, the workers were almost done. Karen stood near a new sign that read HOA Independent Water Project, a community initiative. Cameras flashed as a local news crew interviewed her. We're proud to take control of our own resources, she said into the microphone, smiling like a politician. No more middlemen. John sat quietly in his truck at the edge of the road, watching. The irony made him almost laugh. She was celebrating independence from a man she didn't even know was her supplier. He started the engine, turned the truck around, and drove off toward the old water control building on the far side of his ranch. It was small, hidden behind trees, but inside it was the nerve center of everything. The pump regulators, pressure systems, and digital controls that governed every gallon flowing to the HOA's community. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and flipped on the light. The hum of machinery filled the room. On the main screen, the HOA's water usage blinked steadily. He smiled faintly, his hand brushing over the control panel. Let's see how they handle owning something they can't control, he whispered. The machines continued to hum softly, a quiet reminder that in this fight, power didn't belong to the loudest voice. It belonged to the one who owned the source. John didn't say a word to anyone that morning, but the silence around him carried weight. He woke before sunrise, brewed his coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, looking out the window toward the fields where the pipeline now ran like a scar across his land. The trench stretched far and deep, the ground still raw from yesterday's work. The HOA had moved fast, too fast. He could already see new metal sections stacked near the edge, ready to be lowered in. They thought they were building freedom, a new system to cut costs and control their own water. But they had no idea the veins they were laying would soon choke their own lifeline. John picked up his old leather notebook and began to write. Dates, times, photos printed out and taped neatly, notes about every worker and vehicle that entered his property. He didn't plan revenge out of anger. He planned it like a man preparing a quiet storm. By the time the sun climbed higher, he was dressed in his old ranch coat and heading toward the utility house, hidden at the far edge of his land. Few people even knew it existed. The small structure was built low, almost blending into the dirt, with just a metal door and a warning sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." He unlocked it and stepped inside, the hum of machinery filling the silence. Screens flickered to life, showing flow rates, reservoir levels, and distribution paths, all under his control. He scrolled through the system until he found the route labeled North Creek Subdivision. That was the HOA. Every gallon that reached their lawns and pools passed through his company's network, through his wells and his filters. He ran a diagnostic check and smiled faintly when he saw how dependent they were. They'd never built redundancy. They couldn't survive without him even for a day. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, and whispered, "You dug into your own water supply, Karen, and you don't even know it." When he returned home, he saw HOA trucks parked along the fence line. The board members were touring the site, cameras flashing, smiles wide for the local news. Karen was there, of course, dressed in a white suit and holding a clipboard like she was running a company. She spoke into a microphone with confidence, saying, "This is a new beginning for our community, a sign that we don't have to depend on overpriced water contracts anymore." John watched from a distance, leaning against his truck, the wind lifting his hat slightly. He could almost laugh at the irony. Every drop of that overpriced water came from him. She was bragging about breaking free from the very man who kept her fountains running. He turned away and drove back down the dirt road, his tires crushing the gravel as he went. That night, as the last of the machines shut down, John stood at the edge of the trench again. The moonlight shone on the steel pipes, glinting silver beneath the dirt. He could feel the faint vibration under his boots, the hum of the water system still flowing beneath. It was strange, standing there in the quiet, knowing he held the switch to everything. He could shut it down at any moment. But he didn't. Not yet. Revenge wasn't about striking first. It was about timing. He crouched beside the new pipe and traced its line with his flashlight until it disappeared into the distance. The HOA had built their line to connect directly into the old flow, his flow, without realizing it. In trying to separate from him, they had welded themselves to his system even tighter. It was poetic. He stood and brushed the dirt from his hands, looking toward the glowing windows of his house in the distance. The next morning, the HOA sent him an official letter. It was delivered by a courier, folded neatly in a blue envelope with the HOA seal stamped on the front. Inside was a short, arrogant message. Per community vote, the HOA has full authority to proceed with the water pipeline construction as part of the local improvement project. Please refrain from interference. No signature, no courtesy, just bureaucracy hiding behind confidence. John read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. He poured himself another cup of coffee and smiled quietly. They thought a piece of paper could stop him. They didn't realize he was already 10 steps ahead. That afternoon, he called a small meeting with his operations manager from Harris Utilities, a middle-aged woman named Linda who had worked with him for years. They met at the pump control site, away from any HOA eyes. "You ever hear of the HOA project?" he asked her. She nodded. "Yeah, they're bragging all over town about their new independent system. Heard they're almost done." John smirked. "They're connecting into our main line without knowing it." Linda's eyebrows rose. "You're serious?" He nodded slowly. "They think they're building freedom, but what they're doing is tying themselves to us completely. We can redirect their flow anytime." She crossed her arms, smiling faintly. "So what's the plan?" He leaned against the wall, looking at the flickering lights on the panel. "Nothing yet. Let them finish. Let them celebrate. Then, when they turn the tap, they'll realize who really owns the water." By evening, news spread through the neighborhood that the pipeline would be complete within 48 hours. The HOA scheduled a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Karen sent out emails boasting about how efficient leadership and community unity had made this possible. People were excited. Homeowners stopped by the site to take pictures, some waving to John as if everything were fine. He waved back politely, never mentioning the truth. Inside, though, he was calm, patient, and certain. Late that night, the stars burned bright over the ranch. John sat by his fireplace, looking over the thick stack of documents on his coffee table. Contracts, ownership records, legal filings. Everything was lined up perfectly. He had the deeds, the maps, and the proof that the HOA had trespassed and damaged private utility infrastructure. But that wasn't what mattered to him most. What mattered was control. When the time came, he wouldn't need courts or police or arguments. He would just turn a single valve. The sound of the crackling fire filled the room. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let the warmth wash over him. Let them finish digging, he whispered to himself again, a faint smile crossing his lips. They're building their own downfall. Outside, the night was still, the trench silent, but beneath the ground water flowed steadily. Every drop under his command, waiting for his next move. 3 days later, the first signs of trouble began to surface, and the HOA had no clue what was coming. The lawns across the community were starting to turn dry at the edges. The sprinklers that usually danced every morning sputtered weakly and then died. By noon, the residents began complaining in the community group chat. The water pressure was gone, showers ran only in trickles, and the expensive pool Karen had built behind her own house had stopped refilling halfway. She stormed out to the site in heels, her voice sharp as she shouted at the workers to check the valves and pumps. Everyone blamed the new connection, but no one understood why the system wasn't delivering water. Meanwhile, John sat on his porch watching from a distance, a calm smile playing on his face as the first stage of their panic unfolded. He didn't touch anything. Yet, the system was still running, but he had reduced the pressure slightly the night before, just enough to cause confusion. He wanted them to taste uncertainty, to feel helpless, and he knew they would come to him soon. He always believed power wasn't loud, it was quiet and patient, the kind that made people come knocking without realizing who opened the door for them. By afternoon, the HOA called an emergency meeting inside their clubhouse. All board members gathered around the long table, papers scattered, voices raised. Karen slammed her hand down, saying the construction company must have connected the pipe wrong. The contractor insisted everything had been done according to plan. They argued for hours while residents outside demanded answers. One man shouted, "My kids can't even shower." Another yelled, "The pool's empty. The grass is dying. What's going on?" Karen promised it was temporary, but she was sweating. The cameras from the news crew that had once praised her were now gone, leaving her exposed to the angry crowd. She sent a few men to check the old line, but when they returned, their faces were pale. "Ma'am," one of them said quietly, "the main valve to our supply isn't responding. It's not ours. It's under someone else's control." Karen froze, staring at them in disbelief. "What do you mean, not ours?" she snapped. "Who controls it then?" They shrugged helplessly. "We don't know. It's marked under Harris Utilities." For a second, she didn't even understand. Then realization began to flicker in her eyes like lightning. Harris? That name. It couldn't be. She turned to the window and saw John's ranch stretching across the horizon, silent and vast, and her stomach twisted. That evening, John was sitting in his small office when his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. He answered anyway. "Mr. Harris?" a nervous voice said. "This is Mark from the HOA board. We seem to be having some technical trouble with the water. Could we maybe talk?" John leaned back in his chair, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. "Technical trouble?" he said slowly, pretending not to know. "What kind?" The man stuttered. Well, no pressure in the lines. People are upset. We were wondering if you know anything about the water supply routes under your land?" John's tone remained calm, polite, almost too polite. "I know a few things about them, yes, why?" Mark hesitated. "It seems your company, Harris Utilities, is listed as the current supplier, and we weren't aware of that." John smiled faintly to himself. "You weren't aware because you never asked," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. "Tell Karen if she wants water, she should come talk to me directly." Then he hung up. As the sun dipped below the hills, The community grew restless, car engines revved as residents drove around looking for bottled water. Some argued near the clubhouse gates. Others dragged hoses from neighbors' yards hoping for a trickle. Karen stood on her driveway holding her phone, staring at the dark windows of John's ranch in the distance. Pride burned inside her, but desperation was louder. She finally drove up the dirt road that led to his property, dust swirling behind her SUV. When she arrived, John was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee as if waiting for her. She stepped out, voice sharp but shaky. "John, we have a situation. There seems to be an issue with the main water line." He looked at her evenly. "Seems so," he said, taking a slow sip. "You built through my land without asking. Didn't even bother to read whose company supplied your water. Now your precious HOA doesn't have a drop." She opened her mouth to argue but stopped. He continued, "You thought you were cutting ties with me, but you just cut into the very system that keeps you alive." She took a step forward, her voice low. "Can you fix it?" He smiled slightly. "Of course, but not for free." The next morning chaos ruled the neighborhood. People lined up with buckets near the maintenance shed hoping for delivery trucks. Others called the city demanding answers only to be told, "The HOA's supply comes from a private contractor. Please contact your service provider." Which meant John. Every phone call circled back to him. Karen called 3 times that morning, leaving messages that started polite and turned desperate. By noon, he finally returned her call. "Karen," he said smoothly, "I've been thinking about your little project. It caused a lot of damage on my property, destroyed fences, crushed irrigation, trespassed on private ground. I'll fix your water problem if you fix mine." She didn't answer immediately. The line was silent. Then she said through gritted teeth, "You're blackmailing me." He chuckled softly. "No, I'm teaching you respect. There's a difference." That night, the lawns were dead silent. No sprinklers, no fountains, no running water. The once proud community looked abandoned. Porch lights flickered weakly as people sat outside in frustration. John walked through his fields under the moonlight. The trench was still there, ugly and deep, but now it felt like a warning carved into the land. He stopped beside one of the new pipes, listening to the faint metallic echo inside. He whispered, "You wanted independence, you got it." Then turned back toward his house, the wind carrying the sound of his quiet laughter over the dry earth. Inside his control station, the flow rate to the HOA zone blinked red, 0 output, full cutoff, and on his desk lay a single envelope marked HOA damage claim ready to be sent. Everything was unfolding exactly as he planned, and the HOA, for the first time, had learned what it meant to dig too deep into something they didn't understand. The next morning, the HOA office was in chaos, papers scattered, phones ringing off the hook, and Karen Reed pacing back and forth in her heels as angry residents shouted from the hallway. Every voice demanded answers. The community had been without water for 2 full days now, and panic was growing. Lawns were dying, toilets didn't flush, showers ran dry, and even the rich folks with fancy pools had started hauling buckets from their car washes just to fill sinks. Karen's hair was a mess, her tone sharp as she barked orders at anyone who would listen. "Call the city again. I don't care what they said yesterday, this has to be fixed." But the city had already made its stance clear. The HOA's pipeline wasn't their responsibility. The city records showed that the water supply contract was private, belonging to Harris Utilities, the name that had begun to haunt Karen's every thought. She slammed the phone down so hard the table shook. "That old man planned this?" she hissed. "He's doing this to make me look stupid." But deep down she knew it wasn't just about pride anymore. This was about control, and John Harris had all of it. Meanwhile, John sat in his home office, the soft hum of the control monitor filling the quiet. On the screen, the HOA's section of the network blinked red, flow set to 0. His fingers rested calmly on the desk as he watched the data scroll. Numbers falling, pressure dropping, consumption flatlining. It wasn't anger he felt. It was justice, quiet, clean, absolute. He had given them every chance to respect his boundaries. But they laughed in his face. Now they would learn that arrogance always comes with a price. He leaned back in his chair, sunlight filtering through the blinds, his phone buzzing again. Another call from the HOA office. He ignored it. Instead, he opened the folder marked Damage Estimates, listing every section of his land they had ruined: broken irrigation, destroyed fencing, trench repair, soil restoration. It was all neatly totaled and printed, ready to deliver. By noon, Karen and 2 other board members arrived at his ranch uninvited, their SUV kicking up a storm of dust behind it. John watched them pull up from the porch, not moving until they climbed out and walked toward him. Karen forced a polite smile, though her eyes burned with frustration. "John?" she began, her voice too sweet to be sincere. "We really need to resolve this issue. The community is suffering, the pipeline needs water, and it seems your system might be part of the problem." John tilted his head, his tone calm. "Might be," he said quietly. "Karen, your entire system is my system." She froze for a moment, the men beside her exchanging nervous looks. "That's impossible," she snapped. "We built our own line. We have our own network now." John stood up slowly, pulling a binder from under his arm. "You built it right into mine," he said as he opened the binder to the contract signed 5 years earlier by the previous HOA president. Clearly listing Harris Utilities as their water supplier, he pointed to the logo at the bottom, bold and unmistakable. "You've been paying me for 5 years, you just didn't bother to read the fine print." Karen's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks as realization set in. She looked down at the paper, her voice cracking slightly. "You own the water company?" John nodded once. "And you just trespassed on the main line of that company, dug through my land, broke my property, and claimed it as your project. So yes, you might say I own more than the water right now. I own this conversation too." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant caw of a crow and the faint hum of a tractor somewhere far away. One of the board members cleared his throat. "Mr. Harris, we're willing to, negotiate, perhaps reach a compromise." John's expression didn't change. "Compromise?" he repeated slowly. "Like the one you offered when you stole my land?" Karen's temper flared. "We didn't steal anything. It was an honest mistake. The paperwork got mixed up." John raised an eyebrow. "You called it community improvement, remember? You even told the news I'd thank you later." She opened her mouth, but no words came. He continued. "You destroyed my property without permission, violated state law, and now you've damaged the main water line that serves your own neighborhood. You want water back? You'll pay for what you broke." He turned to go back inside, but Karen reached out desperately. "Wait, please, we can't go another day without water. People are threatening to sue the HOA. The city's washing its hands of it. Tell us what you want." John stopped, looking at her over his shoulder, his voice low and steady. "I want repairs, compensation, and an apology in writing from the entire board, and I want that trench filled and my land restored. When that's done, maybe I'll consider turning the water back on." They stood there speechless as he walked away, the sound of the screen door creaking behind him. Inside his house, John watched from the window as Karen argued with her board members. Her hands waving, her voice cracking. He could almost read her lips. She was saying, "We don't have that kind of money." But that wasn't his concern. He knew the HOA's funds were stretched thin. They'd spent everything on the pipeline construction and the publicity around it. They didn't even have enough reserves to pay for repairs. They'd have to go public, admit fault, or face lawsuits from angry homeowners. Either way, he had them cornered. That evening the sun dipped low, bathing the ranch in shades of gold and orange. John stepped out onto the porch, the air cool and quiet. The pipeline stood silent now, its steel sections glinting in the last light. He could almost hear the panic spreading across the neighborhood, people lining up at grocery stores for bottled water, lawn care crews quitting, families packing bags to stay elsewhere, all because a few arrogant people thought they could walk over one man and his land. He sat down, folded his arms, and watched the horizon with calm satisfaction. Sometimes, he murmured to himself, the best revenge is letting people feel their own mistakes. The night fell slowly, and the world went still except for the faint hum of the pumps in his control room, the only sound that mattered, the sound of power resting in his hands. The next morning the entire neighborhood was in uproar. Homeowners gathered outside the HOA office shouting, holding empty buckets and signs demanding water. Children cried while parents argued, and reporters had returned. This time not to praise but to expose the disaster that had unfolded under Karen's leadership. Inside the building, Karen sat at the conference table with her board, her hair tied up hastily, papers piled high in front of her, her voice shaky as she tried to maintain control. "We can't let this story spread any further," she said. We'll lose the entire community if we don't fix this. One of the members slammed a file on the desk. Fix it? How? The man owns the water. He literally controls our supply line. Another added. We trespassed on his land, Karen. This isn't something we can just smooth over. Her face turned red. Don't tell me what I already know, she snapped. We'll find a way. We'll sue if we have to. But deep down she knew it was hopeless. Harris Utilities wasn't just a small local company. It was the backbone of their system. Cutting him out meant cutting themselves off completely. Outside the building, residents yelled louder. One woman screamed, "You promised us independence. You ruined everything." The security guards struggled to calm them down as tempers boiled over. The air was thick with heat and tension. At that same time, John Harris sat inside his control room miles away, calm, collected, his eyes on the glowing monitor showing a steady stream of data. The HOA line still marked red, no flow, full pressure blocked. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee slowly, the quiet hum of the machine soothing like a heartbeat. He knew the HOA had finally realized the full scope of their mistake, and he knew they were running out of options. His phone buzzed again. Another call from Karen. He let it ring out, then another and another, until finally he picked up on the fourth. "Mr. Harris?" Karen began, her voice thin, tired and desperate. "We're prepared to meet your terms, please. The residents are suffering. We can't go another day like this." John paused for a moment before replying. "You caused this, Karen. You ignored every warning. You treated my property like dirt and called it progress, and now you want help?" She tried to keep her tone steady. "I understand you're angry, but let's be reasonable. We'll compensate you for the damage. We'll restore your land. Just turn the water back on." He smiled faintly, though she couldn't see it. "Send me the signed apology from the entire board first," he said. "Then we'll talk." She hesitated. "You can't expect me to." "You have until midnight," he interrupted, his voice cold and final. Then he hung up. By afternoon, the HOA office was a battlefield. The board arguing, members quitting mid-meeting, and Karen finally realizing her control was slipping away. She signed the document herself, then forced the remaining board members to do the same, swallowing her pride in front of them. When the last signature was inked, she scanned it and sent it to John's email, the message short and hollow. Apology attached. "Please restore water immediately." John opened the document, read it slowly and nodded, then stood, walked to the control panel, and flipped the main valve switch halfway open. The sound of rushing water filled the pipes, distant and powerful. The system hissed and clicked as pressure returned. In the neighborhood, faucets sputtered, then poured, sprinklers hissed to life, and a wave of relief swept across the community. Cheers echoed through the streets, people clapping and hugging, but none of them knew the full story. They didn't know that the same man they had mocked and ignored had just saved them, and more importantly, that he still held the key. That night, the HOA held an emergency meeting with homeowners to explain what had happened. Karen stood at the podium, trying to sound in control. "The issue has been resolved," she announced. "The supplier has agreed to restore water." But a man from the crowd shouted, "You mean John Harris did?" Another added, "You dug through his land and lied to us?" The room erupted in angry voices. Karen tried to talk over them, but it was no use. Her voice drowned beneath the noise. The once proud HOA president was now nothing more than a figure of failure, her empire of arrogance crumbling in front of everyone. She gathered her papers quickly and walked out, her head bowed, the flash of reporters' cameras catching every step. The next day headlines spread online. HOA project fails. Local rancher exposes massive mismanagement. And Harris Utilities became a name everyone respected. Some feared, but all depended on. Later that evening, John sat by his porch again, the sky glowing orange as the sun sank behind the fields. The faint sound of sprinklers now filled the air again, peaceful and steady. He felt no guilt, only quiet satisfaction. He had taught them what respect meant, not through shouting or lawsuits, but through patience and precision. Karen's SUV drove past slowly on the road below, and though she didn't stop, she glanced up at his house with a mix of anger and humiliation. John lifted his coffee cup slightly in her direction, a small nod that said everything words didn't need to. As her car disappeared down the road, he turned his eyes back to the fields, the soil damp again, his land safe, and the water flowing exactly where he allowed it to flow, not one drop more. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself. You wanted control, Karen, but control was never in the pipes. It was always in the hands of the man who owns the ground. The night settled soft and still. The hum of the pumps continued deep underground, and the HOA, now humbled and broken, finally understood that they could build all the pipelines they wanted. But they'd never move an inch without the quiet power of John Harris watching from his porch, patient as ever, reminding them every day that respect must be earned, not taken. By the end of that long, chaotic week, the HOA finally broke apart under its own arrogance. The damage from their so-called independent project was everywhere. Half-buried pipes, muddy trenches, ruined lawns, and the trust of the residents was gone. Lawsuits were being whispered in every corner, and Karen Reed could hardly step outside without feeling the weight of every glare aimed her way. Her fancy SUV that once gleamed with pride now sat covered in dust. The HOA president plate removed from the dashboard. She had gone from queen of the neighborhood to the face of humiliation in just a few days. Meanwhile, the city had stepped in to investigate the unauthorized construction. Reporters filled the sidewalks, asking how a local board could destroy private property without permits, and every finger pointed toward the same name, Karen Reed, the woman who thought she could control everything. John Harris watched it all unfold quietly from his porch. No anger left in him, just a steady calm born from justice. The land around his ranch was alive again. Grass returning where trenches once cut deep, water flowing smoothly through the systems he'd built with his own hands. Every pipe under his control. Every valve a reminder that real power doesn't come from loud meetings or polished speeches. It comes from ownership, from patience, from knowing when to act and when to wait. One afternoon, John received a letter delivered by a city official, neatly typed and stamped with the HOA's seal. It wasn't another demand or complaint. It was a settlement agreement. The HOA had been ordered to pay full damages for the destruction of his property, restore every inch of land, and issue a public apology through local media. At the bottom of the page were the signatures of the board, including Karen's, written in shaky pen strokes. John read it slowly, then set it aside, a quiet satisfaction washing over him. Later that week, a convoy of construction trucks arrived. Not the HOA's arrogant machines, but professional crews hired by the city to rebuild what had been ruined. They repaired his fences, leveled the fields, replanted grass, and when it was done, the land looked untouched, peaceful, whole again, just as it had before Karen's pride tore through it. Neighbors stopped by to thank him. People who once looked down on him now treated him with respect. One elderly woman from the HOA community came to his gate holding a small jar of cookies. "You saved us from her?" she said softly. "We didn't know what was really happening." John smiled kindly. "You didn't need saving," he replied. "You just needed to see who was really turning the wheel." She nodded and left. And as he watched her go, he realized that sometimes the best victories aren't shouted. They're remembered in silence. A month later, the court hearings were over. The HOA lost everything. Funds drained, reputation ruined. Karen stepped down officially and moved away quietly under the cover of night. The new board that replaced her visited John personally to shake his hand, promising that from now on no project would touch his land without permission. He accepted their apology but said little, letting his calm gaze speak for him. He didn't need to gloat. The truth had already done the work. When they left, he walked the edge of his property one last time. The sun low and golden over the fields, the repaired pipeline buried deep and silent under his soil. He stopped at the spot where the first trench had been dug, ran his hand across the soft dirt, and whispered, "You thought you were building a future, Karen, but you were only burying your own pride." The wind carried his words across the field, soft and steady like the flowing water beneath. That evening, as darkness settled, lights flickered on across the subdivision. Sprinklers came alive again, the sound of running water echoing through the streets, every drop a reminder that peace had returned under his control. John sat back in his chair on the porch, hat tilted low, the night insects humming softly around him. In the distance, he could see the reflection of the water tower glowing faintly against the sky, the one marked Harris Utilities. And he smiled, a quiet, contented smile, not of revenge but of balance restored. He had fought without shouting, won without destroying, and taught an entire community that respect isn't demanded with power. It's earned through patience and truth. As the stars blinked overhead and the hum of the pumps rolled steady beneath his land, John closed his eyes, breathing in the cool night air, the world calm once more, his land untouched, his water flowing, and the HOA forever remembering the man they underestimated, the man who owned the very ground beneath their feet.